Good morning. We're back. Make sure microphone's on. Everything's good. You're gonna hear probably some sound and feedback in the background. That's a little birdie playing with his Darth Vader toy. He's gonna be joining us today. Today's gonna be rather brief. We're gonna go through the PowerPoint today, and then I'm gonna let you guys do it. You guys, we're gonna have a 2-paragraph summary on the introduction to the Civil War. So we're gonna be talking about things like you know what? Let's just get right into the PowerPoint so that way we don't kind of play around here today. Today's going to be very brief. We're going into a weekend. We'll have a good weekend. We'll have, like I said, you're going to have a 2-paragraph summary on the intro to the Civil War. You should also have done your discussion board on the Fugitive Slave Act. You should have also done the reading like a historian and taken your test. So those are the assignments to dictate whether you were present in here today. Good morning, Nathan. How are you? Good morning, Connor. Cooper. No, buddy. That's mine. Go here. Get your book. So, good morning to everybody who is here. So hopefully we can get started and we can roll through this. All right, so let's get a move on. No, not yet. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the Civil War today, specifically. Shh. No, buddy.
No.
You smell like poopy again. How did you poop again? Here, play with this. Hold on 1 second. We're going to go ahead and let him go loose. And we're back. I apologize. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to go ahead and get started now that he's better occupied doing something else, having more fun. We're going to go into the Civil War. I'm going to try not to talk so fast. We're going to go through this. Hopefully everybody has their last assignments done, completed. Hopefully everybody finishes their test. Remember, everything is due by Sunday, so as soon as you guys get it done, it says there are 3 viewers. Right now mine says like 17, so I don't know. It's whatever. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Oh, I'm on the wrong screen. Sorry. Here we go. Boom. So as we said yesterday, where we left off was that President Lincoln, or Abraham Lincoln, wins the election in 1860, right? Which subsequently led to the entire South seceding from the Union. Now, he was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, and he would also read his first inaugural address, determine the following, which he includes the following. So he brings up secessionists, so all the people who've left from the South, non-secessionists, the people who stayed with us, the compromise proponents, unionists, abolitionists. These are all the people he's talking to. So unionists are the people who want to maintain the Union and keep the country together. Abolitionists, of course, are people who want to abolish slavery and end it. So as you guys can see, they're building the current Capitol building at the time of his election. So let's get into this. Now, Lincoln was morally opposed to slavery and did not support its spread. Okay, so think about the Crittenden Amendments. The idea was not to get rid of slavery, right, altogether, but to stop it from spreading. So we're not going to ban cigarettes, but we're going to make it harder for people to buy them. There you go. However, he did say that he would not interfere with the institution where it was already legal. So he said... So one of the biggest misnomers about Abraham Lincoln was he wanted to free the slaves from the beginning. That is not true. He didn't like slavery. He didn't want it to keep continuing to spread. He just said, we're not going to allow slavery in any region that it's currently not already present in. But then we're also going to go ahead and allow those who currently already have it to maintain it. So at this point, what we're saying is he just doesn't want it to continue to spread, but leave it legal where it is. And that's what he would say in his first inaugural address. He also asserted the authority over all U.S. states and that had seceded from the Union. So he does not acknowledge that South Carolina, Texas, Arkansas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, all these states, and there's more, had seceded from the Union. He does not recognize this. Is there an assignment for today? Yes, it will be posted as soon as the stream is over, which is not going to be long from now, probably about a half hour. And then it is just a 2-paragraph summary on this particular slideshow. Okay? Now, the war really begins at Fort Sumner. Okay, South Carolina had a fort called Fort Sumner. It was a federal fort. Okay, so the United States military had a fort here. However, South Carolina claimed it was theirs. Lincoln informed South Carolina's governor that he was sending provisions in an unarmed ship. Okay, now Confederate forces attacked that fort before the ship could reach it. So South Carolina claimed that this fort belongs to them, even though it was a U.S. federal military installation. So this caused a little bit of a rift. Okay, now the American commander surrendered the next day, and no one was really killed, but it did mark the beginning of the war. A horse died, but that's about it. Okay, now Lincoln also requested 75,000 volunteers to help suppress the rebellion. So at this point, the Union is kind of like the British during the American Revolution. Their goal was to suppress this rebellion, suppress the battle. Okay? Stop it from spreading. Okay, now, let me do this because this typically helps get people to show up. Even we are live now. Sorry, give me 1 second. Next. Currently live. Send. Cool. Now, 4 more states would also secede because of this particular example. So let's take a look at whose side is on who. So California, Oregon, Kansas, Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine were all staying part of the Union. Whereas Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina were had already seceded by April of 1861, but after Fort Sumner, the states that would go off was Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and what you're going to see is there's a bunch of states in pink. Now these are slave states that would be, I'm going to use, loyal to the Union. Now these are what we call the border states, and the border states were incredibly important because these would be the states where you would assume that most of these battles would be fought. It's the middle ground between the North and the South. However, many of these states were given a provision to maintain their slaves, but as long as they remained loyal. You'll notice a new state was created in 1863, and it's called West Virginia. The reason why West Virginia was even created in the first place was because of the Civil War. When Virginia seceded from the Union, most of it was to maintain their slaves. The problem is West Virginia is not like the rest of Virginia. So this western portion, this northwestern portion of Virginia that used to be all one state, was not like the rest of it. In fact, it's mostly mountainous, because if you think about the college football team, the West Virginia, they're called the West Virginia Mountaineers. And the West Virginia Mountaineers, the slavery was not as necessary out in the mountains. So they rarely, if ever, had any slaves up in this region. Okay? Now, how do we respond? Well, some in Virginia opposed to it. Like we were just saying, West Virginia would eventually go and secede from Virginia and become its own state and be a part of the Union. Tennessee, there was a lot of debate going strong here. But the original Confederate states of America, right? South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas. The Constitution emphasized that states' rights and the protection of slavery in any newly acquired territory. So ultimately what their whole main point was, the Confederate States of America, these southern states that seceded from the United States, they wanted to protect state rights and allow states to determine whether or not they should or should not have slaves. That was the most important part for them. That's the part that they wanted to protect most. Jefferson Davis, like we said yesterday, would be their first president. The capital would be in Richmond, Virginia, which is very close to Washington, D.C. Okay, here's a picture of my man Jefferson Davis. Looking fly. Okay. Now, we just talked about those border states. These refer to slave states that remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, mostly because of their proximity to the Union. They feared actually leaving it. Okay, so that includes Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and eventually West Virginia. Okay. Now, following a confrontation in Baltimore, the area was occupied and habeas corpus was suspended. Now, if you remember from civics, habeas corpus meant that you could be held without any reasoning. So I can arrest you and put you in jail without telling you why. Okay, so that was suspended. Confederates could be arrested and jailed without any charges Indefinitely. So I can just put you in jail because I think you're bad, and I'm assuming you are going to do something bad. Okay? Not only that, but Lincoln would also put cannons on the rooftops of everywhere in Baltimore and say, hey, if you guys try to secede, adios, mis amigos. Okay? Now, resources for the war. So what were some of the things that we knew? Well, if you look, comparing the North to the South, it looks a lot like the American Revolution. This should have been an epic beatdown. Okay? So you have 1.3 million workers in the North producing raw materials and weapons for the cause, for the fight, versus about 110,000. Okay? You had 110,000 factories in the North to about 18,000 in the South. You have an estimated value of goods produced about 1.5 billion to 155 million. 70% of the railroads in the United States were in the North, only 30% in the South. That's important for shipping raw materials as well as soldiers, as well as weapons. In terms of textile, cloth, woven goods to make things like uniforms and other things like that, 17-to-1 ratio. In terms of weapons, 32-to-1. Okay? In terms of creating iron, 20-to-1. In terms of producing materials, the North was ready for war. The South was ultimately desperate. Okay, they were going to have to rely on others. So what was the Union strategy for going to war with the South? If we're going to try to bring them back in the Union, if we're going to try to bring it all back home so that everybody gets along, a couple things we had to do. First, originally it was developed by General Winfield Scott. And the idea was, it was known as the Anaconda Plan. It called for a blockade of the southern ports and the capture of the Mississippi River. This makes a lot of sense because how do you ship goods? What is the fastest way to move materials? Even back then, boats. You take over the Mississippi River, you block the southern ports, you can't get anything coming in. As we already just said in the last screen back here, they don't produce a lot. They can't come up with enough weapons, clothes, and just manufactured goods to maintain a long established war effort. So how do you get supplies? You import it in from other places. You go to other countries and say, hey, look, we need guns, we need this, we need that, and you ship them in. But if you put a blockade or a series of ships that blocks people from coming in, you can't get those things. Okay, so you're trying to ultimately kill a fly in a cupboard, right? A fly flies into the cupboard, you close the door, there's no access to food, there's no way out. Eventually it's going to starve to death. That's ultimately their goal that they're going to do. Lincoln did attempt to establish a blockade, but it did not have the manpower to capture and control the Mississippi River. Probably so, right? The Mississippi River is the longest river in the United States. It's the third longest river on Earth. It's a very difficult thing to actually blockade and control. Okay? So their goal was to strangle the South into submission. As you can see. The Great Snake. Now, what were the advantages the South had? Well, they had home court advantage, much like the Americans in the Revolution, right? The vast majority of the war was fought in the South. They're the ones who seceded. They're the ones who left, so the Union had to go to them to come get them, right? Most of the fighting took place in the South, forcing the North to travel and maintain long supply lines, much like how the British had to. Now, the South actually had a specific reason to fight, right? Again, they had that. They wanted to preserve their way of life. Think back to the American Revolution. The Americans had a reason. The Americans had a reason to fight. What happened? There we go. The Americans had just cause and reason to fight. They did not want to lose their homeland. They felt if they were captured, they would be imprisoned or executed. The South had a reason to fight here. Okay, the North was fighting just to keep the Union together. So it's kind of harder to do that, right? And not only that, but in terms of military officers, the best officers in the United States went to the Confederacy, that including Robert E. Lee. To this day, if you go to West Point Academy in New York, which is the military academy, Robert E. Lee is thought of as probably the greatest American military mastermind in history. He was very talented at strategizing and fighting a war. Now keep in mind, he dragged this war out for almost 6 years with a fraction of the soldiers, a fraction of the materials, a fraction of the equipment, and maintained Southern strength throughout this time. So Robert E. Lee was extraordinarily talented. Here's a picture of the man himself. Okay, look at them gloves. Now, in Southern society, what we had talked about was in Southern society in 1861 was very stratified, which means there were levels. Okay, there was the great planters. So 1% of the population had 20 plus slaves. Okay, so only 1% of all the slave owners, or 1% of all the Southern population, had 20 plus slaves. Okay, now you had about small farmers. 35 to 45% of the population, and they only had about 0 to 5 slaves. Okay. Now they had the landless whites. So these were those who were poor. These are, remember, if you think about like Andrew Jackson, how he became president because he promoted the idea of being able to vote without owning property. This was his target demographic. 20 to 25% of the population. Slaves all made up the final 35% of the population. So if you look at it, the great planters, the top 1% owned the vast majority of all the slaves. Okay? And if you put that in perspective, you're looking at 20 to 25% were landless whites, 35% were slaves. So over half the population in the South, the vast majority of half the population in the South, did not own slaves because they are either too poor to own land or they were slaves themselves. Okay. So you get actual photographs. Now when we get to what were most of the slaves out here doing, and it was cotton. Southern cotton was traded to European nations. America was one of the largest producers of cotton in the world. 75% of all cotton used in Britain, textile mills, came from the American South. So they had a partner. So what they were hoping was that Britain would help them out in their cause, right? So the Southerners hoped that Britain and others would intervene, much like how the French intervened for the Americans to help us become free from Britain. But why did it fail? Well, by 1861, British factories had a surplus of cotton, so they already had what they needed. They didn't really need cotton as much anymore, right? And during the war, they were able to depend on Egyptian and Indian cotton, because remember, Britain was an empire at this time, so Egypt and India was part of their domain, so they could get cotton elsewhere, so they didn't have to depend on the American South. And not only that, but the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll talk about later, redefined the war. And it made it so that it was about slavery. And it made it so that it was like, ooh, we don't want to be the people helping out those who enslave people. That makes us look bad. Okay? Now, the Battle of Bull Run was the first major battle of the actual American Civil War. And it was fought on July 21st, 1861. Now, the assignment's not ready up yet. It'll be up after we're done here. Now, here's the thing. You can go ahead and start writing your summary now and just copy and paste it in, but I'm going to hit unpublish on your assignment as soon as I finish here. Now, the first major battle was in 1861. It's called the Battle of Bull Run. Now, here's the thing. Depending on where you look at it and depending on who you asked, Civil War battles have multiple names. Okay? And the reason is that the North would name cities by the location, and the South would name it give it the nickname. So it depends on. It really does depend on whether you're looking at it from a northern perspective or the southern perspective. Bull Run would be southern perspective, right? The North general was Ian McDowell, sorry, and the South was P.G.T. Beauregard. Fun name. I love it. Now, the Union forces were initially successful until Confederate reinforcements arrived under the command of a man by the name of Thomas Stonewall Jackson, and the Union retreated. Now, Stonewall Jackson was one of the most famous military leaders for the South. Unfortunately, meets a very grim and unsatisfying end. It is due on Sunday, yes. However, the problem with it is he ends up meeting a very unfortunate end, which we will get to in a little bit later. I don't want to spoiler alert it for you. Now, the casualties at Bull Run was about 4,800 people, so about 5,000 men dying. Okay? On the Union, 460 were killed. The Confederates, 387 were killed. But what you have to understand is casualties have different meanings. In civilian life, casualty means anyone who dies. Okay, so if there was a tragedy somewhere and there was 25 casualties, that means 25 people died. In military terms, casualty specifically means number of people who are no longer able to fight, whether they are killed or wounded. So when you see these numbers, 5,000 men, 5,000 casualties, that sounds horrific, which it is. However, it doesn't mean 5,000 people died. So in this case, not even 1,000 died. So 1/5 of those who actually fought here were killed. Union forces and civilians feared that an attack on Washington, D.C. was imminent. Okay, now both sides realized that the war was going to be longer and deadlier than they had anticipated. Okay, so here's some pictures from the war front in 1861. Now, a lot of people always ask, why do the pictures... You're not going to get any real-time actual fighting images from this time during the Civil War, mostly because of the technology they were using. These cameras could not pick up things moving, so you had to have them sitting still, and because it would take anywhere between 25 and 70 seconds or so to develop a picture, so to take an actual image shot. So that's why a lot of times you see people in pictures like this. Not only that, but it's kind of odd to think about. Most people didn't get portraits done of themselves, right? And even if they did, it took a really long time, so you'd have to sit there. So going like this for like several hours while someone paints your portrait would be horrifying. Now, at the other end, though, here's your problem. A lot of people didn't realize you should smile in a picture. And not only that, not everybody had great teeth. So people didn't want to show their teeth because it showed, they had missing teeth and cavities and things like that. Nobody wants to see that. So that's why, if you look at a lot of these pictures of people back in the old days, they look like this. It was very rare for people to actually show their teeth. Okay? As a result of his loss at Bull Run, Lincoln would replace McDowell with George McClellan, who was named General-in-Chief of the Union armies and able to transform the troops into a disciplined army and remain cautious as fighting continued in the East. Okay? Here's my man. Handsome dude. Kind of looks like a Civil War version of Ron Swanson. What a fancy man. Now, the Battle of Shiloh took place in April of 1862. Now, Union forces were led by Ulysses S. Grant, super important, he's on the $50 bill, who planned an attack on a railroad junction near the Mississippi and Tennessee border. Now, Confederate forces then staged a surprise attack on Grant's army. Okay, there's my man Grant. Looks a little bit more exhausted, mostly because he was a bit of a drunk. Let's call what it is. He had an alcohol issue. Okay, ultimately is what killed him. Confederate forces were successful until Union reinforcements arrived the next day. The battle was the bloodiest in American history up to that time. We're looking at 23,000 casualties. At this point, you have to remember, that's more casualties than the American Revolution. And we're talking in single days. And this is in 2 days. When we get to battle on Antietam, that's going to blow this out of the water. You're looking at 1,700 Union soldiers, 1,754 Union soldiers killed, 1,728 Confederate soldiers killed. Okay? This was devastating. This was a devastating battle. And this just showed how deep these divisions laid. And you have to keep in mind, this is American fighting another American. These were, 5 years ago, they were part of the same country, and now they are slaughtering each other. And the reason why some of these numbers are so staggeringly high compared to anything we've talked about before, military technology had vastly improved over the last several decades since the last major war we talked about. Okay? Now, the Battle of Antietam, this is where things get unfortunate, took place on September 17th of 1862. Okay? Confederate forces were led by Robert E. Lee, who invaded Maryland in hopes of gaining needed supplies and European recognition for the Confederacy. Remember, think of like Battle of Saratoga and the American Revolution, right? So they were trying to get the French to like them so they would join in. This is his goal. Let's try to get a definite, strong victory here for the Americans and show Europe that they should be able to back us because we do have a shot at defeating the Union and becoming independent. That was the first major battle that took place on northern soil, technically a border state, but it's close. Tactically, the battle was a draw. So what that means is really nobody won. Okay, Strategically, it was a Union victory as it stopped Lee's invasion. So if you think about it, in terms of fighting, it was a draw. Nobody was clearly a winner. But in terms of what the overall objective of the battle was, the Union won because Lee didn't get his way. The battle was the single day of fighting in the war. So remember, this is a single day, one day, sun up to sundown. Okay? You had casualties of 24,000 in a single day. One day. Those other battles we were talking about were over the course of several days. This is one day. Okay? 2,000 Union soldiers killed. 1,546 Confederate soldiers killed. Okay? In a single day. This is one day. Now keep in mind, modern day, you could have something far more devastating. Clearly. Okay? You can think of Hiroshima during the Second World War. You had about 110,000 in an instant. Not an instant, but in several hours. Done. But we're talking back then, the technology was so new and people did not know how to fight, and you had farmers, blacksmiths, lawyers, just regular people fighting. It was devastating. And you have to keep in mind. Now, Antietam was also an important diplomatic victory because Lincoln reconsidered his views concerning the war and slavery. The idea here is that you're not going to be able to separate slavery from the South. You're not going to be able to bring the South back in without separating it. Okay, slavery was clearly this much of a divisive issue that they're willing to die in droves. Thousands of people to this point. So we're only a few years in, and we've lost thousands of American soldiers. As the war continued and the death toll rose, Lincoln drafted the proclamation to free the slaves. His goal is, if there is no feasible way to maintain the Union with slavery still being there. We've tried it in the past, way back since the Declaration of Independence. Every time slavery got put on the docket, people flipped out, freaked out, and then we had to get rid of it. So at this point in time, he's saying, look, we are getting rid of slavery here, and we're doing it now. So he does something really strategic. Actually, when you think about it, look at him with that top hat, man. My man. So he creates what's called the Emancipation Proclamation. You've probably heard of it before as a name because it's a weird name. It's a fancy name. Emancipation Proclamation, honestly, is just using fancy words to say something very simple. To emancipate means to free, and a proclamation is a statement. So it's the freedom statement. If you want to be more of a 2020, I don't like to use big words, kid. Okay, the Emancipation Proclamation literally means the freedom statement. So if you have a test question in the future that says, what was the purpose of the Emancipation Proclamation? If you just know what was the purpose of the freedom statement, it was to say that slaves should be free. Okay? Now, 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary, the original, Emancipation Proclamation. This freed the slaves residing in states rebelling against the Union. So now all states in the South that had seceded would be freed. Notice he said only the slaves in states that had rebelled. What about those border states that still had slavery, like Arkansas, Missouri, Arkansas, Missouri, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland? What about those states? Well, they would keep them. Because, let's be fair, you're not going to go free a bunch of slaves from states that did not leave the Union. Because that's the fastest way to get them to jump ship and leave and join the Confederacy. So they're going to leave those alone. This allowed Lincoln to maintain support of the border states while pushing them closer to emancipation. So it showed you, hey, look, these states are getting rid of it, but eventually in time you guys will get rid of it too, but not so quickly. Okay? And it transformed the Union war aims. So now the North has a reason to fight. Because at this point, it's like trying to fight to keep a pet that doesn't want to stay in the house, right? The cat keeps trying to dash and run out the window or run out the door. You're going to have a hard time keeping him in there because, he wants to leave. But now you have a reason. This further divided Northern Democrats. Copperhead Democrats wanted to immediately to end the war and saw Lincoln as a tyrant. So these Northern Democrats who kind of got away from being with the Southern Democrats during that last election are now starting to see, oh, well, those Southern Democrats are right, and this is the problem. Okay, now the war Democrats demanded an aggressively policy towards the Confederacy and supported Lincoln. So some of these Northern Democrats who really did not like the way the South was pushing this were like, yeah, back Lincoln, let's do this. Now, And in time, a draft would be issued, the Enrollment Act of 1863. This made men aged 20 to 45 eligible for the draft and established a quota of new troops due from congressional district. Draftees could hire someone else to take their place. So you've probably heard of the term being a draft dodger. A draft dodger is someone who is drafted into military service but does not go and escapes having to go. Back then, there was a legal way to dodge the draft. Now, during Vietnam, people heard, oh, if you go to college, then you don't have to go, blah, 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 blah. That is true, partially. However, back then, all you had to do was pay someone else to go in your place. Okay, so let's just say that, I don't know, Hudson gets drafted into the military. He does not want to go, but we'll pay Will to go in his place. Okay, hey, Will, I'll give you $10 if you go fight for me, so I don't have to go. Sure, and he would go in his place. This is how the wealthy stayed out of having to fight in the Civil War, and this is why more and more poor Americans ended up dying in these wars. Draftees could also pay $300 to avoid service. So they could just pay the government, here's $300, I'm not fighting. And that would be good enough for them. Okay? This is why they turned into the concept of a rich man's war, poor man's fight. So the rich men wanted this war because ultimately, if we look back to an old slide, the vast majority of slaves belong to the wealthiest 1% of Southern landowners. Okay? The North ultimately wants the South to be part of the United States to contain the production of raw materials into their wealthy factories. But who's ultimately fighting the war? Not those rich people who want these goals. It's the poor people who pretty much have nothing at stake here, right? Those 25% of Southerners who don't even own land. Okay, 30 to 45% of Southerners who only had maybe one slave, if any. Okay, those are the ones who are fighting in the war. It's those northern factory workers who live in squalor and terrible conditions, but don't see a dime for lower cotton production costs. If anything, lower cotton production or lower cotton costs would mean more work time for them. So they don't really get anything out of the war. Ultimately, they're the ones having to fight it. So that's why they call it a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, because they're the ones who actually have to fight it. And this would lead to riots, of course. Now, the largest draft riots took place in New York City in July of 1863. The working class white man was targeted, right? Wealthy white men, African Americans, supporters of the war. At least 120 civilians are killed and about 2,000 more were injured. These are just people fighting against the draft because it meant that many of these poor white men were ultimately having to fight these people's wars. Why were African Americans being targeted? Well, because they felt that the war was to free slaves, and if it wasn't for them, they wouldn't have to fight this war. It sounds absurd and crazy and ludicrous, but that's the mentality. And supporters of the war, anybody who pushed for this war to continue, they didn't like it because they, remember, these are the ones having to go and fight it. Now, in early of 1863, the Union prospects seemed dim. At this point, it's not great. Many of the people in the North are struggling with the concept of the draft. They had a very, very abstract view of what they were really fighting for. But by May, the Confederacy defeated a much larger Union force at Chancellorsville in Virginia. And Confederates did suffer a setback because, unfortunately, Stonewall Jackson was mistakenly shot by his own troops. Remember I said Stonewall Jackson was going to meet a very unfortunate end? Here it is. He gets killed by his own men because they mistook who he was. Okay? So his beard was legendary. His defeat was as well. Now we get to the turning point. So much like we said in the American Revolution, Battle of Saratoga was the turning point of the war, right? It was the point where the Americans realized, oh wait, we can actually win this war. We can get support from the French. We can actually come back and have a good chance. The Battle of Gettysburg was the same, but it was both a somber and terrible battle for everybody. In the summer of 1863, Lee proposed an invasion of the North, which is weird because, like I said, most of the war was fought in the South. Okay? Now, we're able to seize much needed food and supplies as they move through Union territory, but in July they engaged the battle with General Meade at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There's General Meade, there you go. Now, here's what I will say. Having been there, Gettysburg is very much just a gigantic field. Okay, lots of hills, trees. It's very beautiful. Don't get me wrong, but the town of Gettysburg is really small. There's a college there now, but it's a small town. But the fighting took place over 3 days. Union troops took a defensive position along what was called Cemetery Ridge. Confederate troops attacked both flanks, which means both sides of the Union line. The largest attack came on July 3rd when troops under the command of George Pickett moved to the center and led what's called Pickett's Charge, or the Last Charge. Pickett's famous Last Charge proved to be a tremendous defeat for the Confederates. Okay. Oh, hit the button wrong. There we go. The 3 days at Gettysburg were the bloodiest engagement of the Civil War. You're talking total casualties were above 50,000. More than 50,000, 50,000 casualties. 3,155 killed, 4,708 Confederates killed. Nearly 1/3 of the Confederacy's general. Let me say that again. Nearly 1/3 of the Confederacy's general officers were killed or wounded or captured. Okay, this was devastating. Now, why are these? When we talk about the casualty numbers being 50,000, 3,000 dead, 4,000 dead, well, that's only about, if you add the other numbers up together, it's about 9,000 people dying, or 8,000 people dying. What's the big deal? But you have to remember, the number one killer of all soldiers of this time during the Civil War, it had nothing to do with being shot initially. It's the illness that comes after it. Infection and disease killed the vast majority of people during the Civil War. And it was rampant. Now, if we talk about military surgery, when we think about surgery, you go into it somewhere, you have an anesthesiologist, their job is to give you a medication that helps reduce your heart rate, keep you calm, comfortable, and sedated so they can perform the surgery in a safe manner, maintaining all your vitals, and then bring you back up and out of it when they're all done. Back then, they had none of those things. Also, you have something called morphine, modern day. Morphine is a painkiller. It's a derivative of opioids, so it's much like its raw, horrible reviews version is heroin. But what morphine does is it allows you to not feel pain. It's very nice for having surgery when they're cutting you open and doing something. So having morphine allows you not to feel the pain, so you feel a little bit better when you're going through surgery. They didn't have that either. So what happens if someone gets shot and the wound is infected? Simply put, they would amputate whatever was shot. So if it was hopefully a limb, you're getting an amputation. So here's your problem. If you had to get an amputation and you don't have morphine to numb the pain, you don't have anything like anesthesia to put you under so that you don't notice it, well, they're going to do something very simple for you. They're going to lay you down, strap you to the table, okay? Most of the time, they put probably a stick between your teeth. That's so that way you don't clench down so high. You might bite your tongue, part of it off. You might break your teeth because sometimes you clench too hard. So they put the stick there just to, have something to chew on when the pain happens. And then they would cut your leg off or arm off or hand off or foot off, whatever needed to be amputated without any type of painkiller. Okay? And it was brutal. So keep in mind, this was at the time the best way to prevent infection, because what happens if you get the infection? It spreads through the blood, it goes, and you get into sepsis where you have poisoned blood, and then it spreads to the body. You go into you go into shock, and you die. So this is the best medical way to stop any of these things from happening. Bite on a stick, and here we go. A lot of times they would also burn the ending of that new nub that you have at the end of your limb, so that way it would stop the body from bleeding. So at that point, you're probably passed out from the pain anyway. So it was pretty brutal. So there's some medical knowledge. So for those of my hosted kids out there, that was the medical. That was your medical lesson of the day. How did they stop wounds in the Civil War? They usually just amputated. That's why many of the soldiers who survived the war ended up leaving with, not all of their limbs intact. Whew. Now, the Siege of Vicksburg, this is really the icing on the cake. This is what starts the downhill spiral for the South. After a 4-month siege, Union forces were finally able to capture a city. For those of us who don't know what a siege is, if we forgot what a siege is where you completely surround a city, okay, and cut off access to the outside world. What's going to happen? They're going to run out of resources, they're going to run out of food, and you're attacking from the outside. Eventually, they're going to give up, okay, but this took 4 months. Soon after, they took control of the entire Mississippi River. So the Anaconda Plan is finally coming into fruition. Together with Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, these are considered the turning points of the war. This is where it was like, okay, the North they've found their footing, and this is going to come to an end. Now, the Atlanta campaign. This is General Sherman's march, and this is where it gets a little. They come up with the concept of total war, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But Atlanta would eventually fall to the troops led by William Tecumseh Sherman in September of 1864, who ordered that all military government buildings be burned to the ground. Now, his goal was it was Sherman's march to the sea. He's going to destroy everything in his path, and it's called total warfare. His mentality is you have to destroy. You ultimately are going to have to destroy their will to fight. So what are they fighting for? At this point, they're fighting for their homes, their livelihoods, their country. You got to destroy those things. Okay? Or else they're going to keep fighting. So he burnt down every government building. He burnt down every farm that they came across. They would put salt in the ground so they couldn't grow things. They would destroy the railroads in the South. They called them Sherman neckties, where they would take them and burn them, the rails, so that they would be hot and moldable. And they would like bend them up into a big cross like this. And eventually they would call them Sherman neckties because he was destroying the railroads as he went. So ultimately, it was a path to try to get rid of. It was a path to try to get rid of the South's will to fight. Now, this would be challenged by the Democratic. So eventually, there would be a victory would help Lincoln win the re-election. He would ultimately he would be challenged by Democratic candidate George McClellan, as well as a radical Republican in his own party. If George McClellan sounds familiar, remember that was his former general-in-chief who ultimately not tries to betray Lincoln in this case, but he tries to use his footing as having some political victories, and he tries to get political victories out of the poor success rate that the Americans or that the Unions had during the initial part of the war, and try to jump up and take out Lincoln and become president himself. But in reality, many people thought that George McClellan was just not really good at his job, and that's why they were doing so bad. Because once he was replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, they started winning things. Okay, now, of course, election 1864, Lincoln wins again. And as we were talking about, Sherman starts going on a march, right? Following Lincoln's victory, Sherman begins his march to Savannah, Georgia, which is the coastal city in Georgia. He moved at a rate of about 10 miles per day, cutting a path of destruction 10 miles wide. Sherman's march to the sea is often credited with breaking the South's will to fight. Okay? So, as you can see, they're destroying the railroads, they burned down buildings, they destroyed farms, they killed livestock, they destroyed agriculture. Their goal was, there was no point in fighting anymore because we destroyed everything you guys loved and fought for. Okay? That's a pretty easy way of doing it. It's kind of like my parenting. If Brody has a fit because I took his toy, then I take his toy and I throw it in the garbage, and then there's nothing to cry about, right? Ta-da! That was Sherman's idea. It's like, I'm going to destroy everything that you're fighting for, so there's no point to fight, so you guys will just surrender. Which ultimately leads us to Appomattox in 1865. This battle involved Grant and Lee, continued until 1865, as Lee retreated from Petersburg in March of 1865. He had few supplies and only about 35,000 men. Grant's troops pressed on, finally forcing Lee to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th of 1865. Now with the surrender, the war comes to an end. Okay, here's a drawing of them coming up to an agreement at the courthouse of Appomattox, ultimately getting the South and the Confederacy to surrender because there was no chance at this point. The numbers of men, the lack of resources, it was only prolonging the inevitable, and Robert E. Lee did not want to sacrifice any more soldiers to die out of vanity and self-idolization. He realized the writing is on the wall. Is it not going well? Unfortunately, it was only a matter of days after this that after the surrender at Appomattox, 5 days later, after Lee's surrender, President Lincoln was shot while attending a play at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., in which he would die the next day. And ultimately, this brings about the end of the Civil War. Now, this seems like we did the Civil War very quickly. This was just, we're going to be talking about all these little pieces one by one. We'll do an entire day on Sherman's March because that one's all really important. We're going to talk about the the differences between Lee and Grant and how they came about. But this was just kind of an introduction to the American Civil War. I wanted to knock out. I did what it was a 36 slide. We did about 45 minutes, not too bad. So I just wanted to get through all of this stuff with you guys, so that way you guys can look at the notes. So if you guys go into Schoology, hold on, let me pull that up. That might help me for a second. I'm sorry, I got this really bad itch on the top of my nose, and I don't know why. Sorry, I'm gonna Schoology. I'm struggling today. You know what? Here, let's do this, so that way we're not seeing all of my things. Boop boop boop. There we are. There you go. You guys get to watch me do that again because it is just itching. Bow, 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 bow. All right, so there you go. Ooh, that was a long pause on there. Sorry, I guess my internet's a little slow this morning. So if you guys go in there today, let's see. You guys will see this set of notes is going to be really helpful for you. If you haven't already looked at it, it's kind of nice to have. Boom, it has all of your stuff, data, information. Boom, it talks about your Anaconda plan and all that stuff. Oh, look at this. That's just nice. It goes in the Battle of New Orleans. We didn't even talk about that today, but that's okay. Okay, look, it even gives you... Oh, man, it's just labeled out. Man, I did a great job for y'all. Okay? So, again, Reconstruction is an entirely separate union that we're going to be focused on later. But your goal today is this. So you guys should have been working on the John Brown Reading Like a Historian. Your next assignment, which you're going to watch me create real time, so that way everybody can say we know what we're doing today, is Civil War PowerPoint summary. Create a 2-paragraph summary. Going over the Civil War PowerPoint is as simple as that. Include 2 pieces of specific information that you found most important in the PowerPoint. There we go. So this is an opinion piece. This is on you. Y'all get to choose. You have to bring up 2 specific parts to it. Was it Sherman's March to the Sea? Was it the Battle of Antietam? Was it, the surrender at Appomattox? That's not doing June. What am I doing? Sorry, guys. I'm all silly right now. Let's make sure it's homework. We're going to make that 10 poets. And then we're going to copy it to all my classes so they all got it. It goes into your Civil War folder. This is the thing I can't stand. Why are we doing this to me, son? There we go. Homework. Folder. So make sure you guys go ahead and complete this, and it will be ready for you momentarily. I'm just making sure everything looks right. Cool. Let's get in the 3rd period. We'll work this way too. Civil War begins. Boop. Homework. Click it. Homework. Homework. 5th period. Homework. We're almost done, guys. I promise. I know this is really exciting content I'm providing for you right now. Homework. I think that's everybody. 7, 6, 5, 4, and 3. Cool. Create. It is in. It is live, I think. Make sure. Booyah. Right there. Oh, you can't say it. Booyah. Right here. It is now live. This is your Civil Point. It is a 2-paragraph summary going over the Civil War PowerPoint. Include 2 pieces of specific information that you found most important in the PowerPoint. So in these 2 paragraphs, you're summarizing it, and you're also giving me the information that you found most relevant to you. So On that note, if you guys need anything, you guys know where to go to. This has been Mr. Robinson Live once again. Again, today's a short day. Going over the PowerPoint. This is what we got to do. So you guys have access to this now. You guys have all the PowerPoints. You guys have notes. You guys have all sorts of stuff. If you guys need anything, please remember I will be upgrading everything on Schoology or Focus on Monday mornings is when I update Focus. Okay, it'd be keeping up with all of those different things. Day to day, it can be very tedious and very difficult. So make sure you guys go ahead and let me know if you guys have been locked out of your tests. I've been trying to keep up with them all. Lots of you have done this. It's very silly. Many of you have done a great job on the test, and thank you again. So once again, as always, if you like this class and other classes like it, go ahead and click like and subscribe. Make sure you go ahead and hit the bell for notifications. Bing! Right over here. And that way you guys know when I'm going on live. So make sure you follow along on the Remind. That's really important. Keep up with those Schoology updates. Keep up with your assignments. We'll all get through this together, guys. I know everybody's struggling a little bit. We'll make it through. So guys, have a wonderful day. Be good, be safe, be well. Oh, hold on. Wait, do we make each paragraph for each thing we found most important? No. Let's be fair. You just need to have two pieces in the paragraph somewhere that you found particularly important. You're summarizing overall what it was about, but then you're going to say, well, in the paragraph, you know what? Let's make it easy for you. I would take one paragraph for each one. That'd probably be best because those are probably going to be more big picture ideas. I doubt you're going to find anything very, very small and specific that you'd have to write an entire paragraph about. But once again, thank you, Zoe, for the question real quick before you left. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please go through Remind or Schoology. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. Emails can be tricky. Have a wonderful day. Be good, be safe, be well. Bye-bye.